Well, welcome everybody. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. I'm excited that you're here. We often do these videos, these webinars, to talk about various components of the goat grazing business, targeted grazing with goats for weed and brush control. And we talk about all aspects of the business, but until recently, we had not tackled the thing that everybody really wants to talk about, which is the goats themselves. We never gotten too deep into that. And so we decided to go ahead and do a full webinar, and it's proven to be really popular. So I'm glad you could join us tonight. We are recording this, and in 2 or 3 weeks, we'll have it up on our YouTube channel. So if you miss anything or would like to recommend it to somebody else, you can go ahead and do that once we get it up on the YouTube channel. I just want to call your attention to something real quick, and that is the chat tool in Zoom's toolbar. If we open up the mics, things start to get messy usually. So the best way to ask questions as we go along is to use that chat tool and just type out your questions. I probably won't get to those as we go along, but when we get to the end, we'll pull up those questions and answer all of them, every single one. So even if you have to duck out at the end of the presentation, I will stay as long as there are more questions flowing in. So again, thanks for joining us. Tonight, we're going to talk all about the goats. But first, I want to point out that I am the founder and owner of Goats on the Go. There's my contact information if you want to get a hold of me to ask any questions that don't get addressed tonight. We have 43 affiliates all across the country. These are local, independently owned small businesses, folks who are providing their own service to the people and communities near them. Some people say it looks like a franchise. I suppose it does. There's some differences between a franchise and what we offer. At its core, we are providing a community of goat grazing professionals that help each other, support each other, receive training and support from us at Goats on the Go, and get to operate under our brand. So we like to say that we get new goat grazing businesses going at 60 miles per hour instead of having to start from a standstill. So if that's something you'd be interested in, we would love to have a conversation with you. So jot down my contact information and let's talk. So what is targeted grazing? Since I mentioned we are goat grazing company operators out there throughout our affiliate network, we're providing the service called targeted grazing. And targeted grazing is simply a strategic way of using animals to control vegetation. For many of our customers, that's just nuisance vegetation that is just kind of a pain in the neck. For other customers, they're really concerned about the loss of native plants to invasive species of plants. And in the West in particular, we're dealing with reduction of vegetation that could be fuel in a wildfire. That's a really big market in the Western US. So what we're doing is just applying goats as a tool to control that vegetation, and sometimes sheep. So the main points here is that we're doing it according to a plan, according to a strategy. We're using the right kind of animals and the right number of animals for the right amount of time. Which is the difference between what we do as a service and just throwing a bunch of livestock on a property for an indeterminate amount of time. So I'm just going to kind of go through this presentation. It's kind of in a frequently asked questions format. And that's kind of my favorite format because it just keeps things loose and lets me address a lot of the questions that have been asked to me in the past. So my answers are just my opinions mixed in with some of the feedback we get from our affiliates all across the country. So it'll be a mix of the way I do it, the way I view it, and the way some of our affiliates approach it. So what kind of goats are best for targeted grazing? A lot of people asking that, they're kind of hinting at what breed of goat should I get? And I'd rather not focus on breed, but rather type. We don't get hung up on breeds too much because we believe that goats just have this inborn desire, this instinct to eat woody vegetation and broadleaf plants and stuff at eye level and above before they go lower to eat the grass. And that has some important implications for us in our business, because a lot of the plants we're hired to address, to eat with our goats, are that type of vegetation. A lot of the invasive plants in North America are woody species of plants or broadleaf weeds. There's some grasses and more herbaceous plants mixed in there that are problems as well, but goats give us the versatility to address all of those plants. And so generally, we're looking at any goats have what it takes to be good grazers. However, what I tell most folks is we probably don't want those goats that have been raised as somebody's 4-H project or their backyard pets. Any goat that has been brought their meals for their whole lives in either a bale or a bucket are going to be less likely to be effective for us, or at least take more time to transition into the kind of feed that we are able to put them on our goat grazing projects. So we like to choose from goats. If I was going to go out and assemble a herd right now to do a goat grazing business with, I would be looking for goats from farms where they're pasture raised, they're out there on their own, selecting from a variety of vegetation to feed themselves. We don't want those pet goats, which can be put into a jungle of vegetation like this goat is, and they'll stand around wondering who's going to feed them. So, but beyond that, we don't care too much about breed. And that said, however, I do have some preferences, but they're mostly not preferences that are built on what will they eat or what won't they eat, because most goats will all eat the same stuff. And I don't want to give you a cop out and not actually mention breed names here. So I'm gonna, at the risk of offending somebody, I'm gonna list some of my favorites. My farm participates in a goat grazing operation as a business, but we also are a meat goat herd producing goats for meat. And we really like Kiko goats. We have found them to be the best compromise for both purposes. We've just speaking in generalities about the breed, we like them in terms of being good mothers. We do recognize some parasite resistance and parasite tolerance that we haven't seen in other breeds. We still trim a lot of hooves. They're not perfect. And even within that breed, there are individuals that just don't make it. In fact, we cull a lot of goats from our herd every year. I typically would not recommend purebred Boer goats. I'm asked that a lot because Boer goats are really popular and a lot of folks have Boer goats. I'm sure that somebody out there is raising some really good hardy lines of Boer goats, but generally they've been so popular that people are not very selective about what they retain and what they continue to breed. And so it is harder to find purebred Boer goats that are low maintenance enough to be out there on these projects doing this work, at least in our system. We've had some Spanish goats. They were good, had a lot of the same qualities as the Kikos do. And we would consider crossbreed goats. So we might have some Boer influence or some crosses with Kikos and Boers or some other breeds, but pure Boers is typically not what we're after. We often get asked about dairy goats. We're asked two questions. Can I raise dairy goats for milking in a goat grazing operation? To which I say, well, you can, but it's really hard to milk those goats twice a day when they're out on somebody else's property away from all your facilities. But I'm also asked, well, can I just use like retired dairy goats, or can I use dairy goat wethers? And absolutely, you sure can. You know, there's a larger, more pendulous udder on most dairy goat females. That's something to consider when we're running them out in the thick brush with thorns and that sort of thing. But what's nice is they're really tall, long-legged goats. They can get up really high and clear that brush and vegetation for our customers. So there's a bit of a compromise to be considered there. Some of our affiliates have reported back that their dairy breeds just don't hold up very well in terms of sickness and disease and that sort of thing. But you know, your mileage may vary on that. What about dwarf goats and pygmy goats? I get that all the time too. And I'll tell you, one of the great things about the goat grazing business is that it's great PR. Just having a project out in a local public park is its own billboard. And so those little goats are super cute and they engage with the public really well. So there's nothing wrong with having some of those goats in a goat grazing herd. But I do tell folks, look, our goal is to eat a lot of vegetation, eat it quickly, eat as high up as we can and be profitable while doing that. And those little goats, typically a herd that's made up in 100% of those little goats probably is not going to be the ticket for us. So we recommend that the majority of the herd be made up of full-size breeds of goats. Should the goats be polled or disbudded? In other words, should they have horns like this guy or not? And, you know, there's two sides to that coin. There's some really good benefits to having horns, and there's benefits to not having horns. Horns do get hung up on things in the brush, in trees, in fences, and that can be a problem. But we think the benefits outweigh the downsides of having horns. First of all, horns are natural, and so we try to avoid we try to be as natural as we possibly can in our system. Second, we think horns are useful for just the social life of goats and determining hierarchy in the herd. And that's pretty important. We like to have a quiet, stable herd. And every time we do something to mess with the status of individuals in that herd, let's say we add some goats or we take out some goats, things rock and roll for a while. The goats kind of reshuffle the deck and they've got to figure out that hierarchy again. And they do that by butting heads and fighting a little bit. And so the horns are just a natural part of that. And lastly, we think the horns are good predator protection also. We want to leave our goats with as many tools as possible to defend themselves. And I already said lastly, but let me add one more thing. Those horns can make good handles too. So when we've got to grab a goat to treat a limp or give medication of some sort, it's really handy to be able to grab the goats by the base of their horns just long enough to be able to do whatever we need to do with them and then let them go again. So we prefer to have horns typically. Some of our affiliates across the country may take a completely different approach to that, but that's my farms and my operations opinion. Where should I go to buy goats? Or maybe more importantly, where should I not go to buy goats? And I would really recommend that if you're planning to have goats on your farm and in your operation for any extended period of time, that you don't go to the local sale barn or the local livestock auction. Most of the goats being sold there are being sold for a reason. And the sale barn offers a really great service to goat producers everywhere, but that service is not to highlight the best breeding goats out there. And once a goat passes through the sale barn, it comes back to your place with every bug and disease and germ that existed at that sale barn and among all the goats that passed through there prior to the ones you bought. So there are a lot of good reasons for the sale barn, but it's not to provide us with good breeding goats or even goats that are non-breeders, but we're going to have them on our farm for an extended period of time. What I'd recommend instead is that you find some of the people who are selling goats at that livestock auction and go to them and buy goats directly from those farms rather than the ones that they're not needing anymore, so they're selling to slaughter at the livestock auction. You can also find goats for sale on Craigslist. And all the breed associations have directories of breeders. So the American Kiko Goat Association, the National Kiko Registry, the equivalents in the Boer goat world, the Spanish goat world, and the dairy goat world, they all have their directories of breeders that you can reach out to as well. Typically, if you're putting together a herd for a goat grazing operation, you don't really want to buy $1,200 per head registered breeding goats. But many of those producers of those registered goats also keep a non-registered commercial herd. And that's likely where you're going to be buying your goats for a targeted grazing operation. So making friends with the same people is still important as you're building up a herd for a targeted grazing business. How much do goats cost to buy? Well, you can spend, just like anything else, you can spend thousands of dollars on a single goat, or you can spend $50 on a goat at the livestock auction. I recommend you look for prices somewhere in between. We are seeing a really strong market for goats right now. There's lots of demand, and that has driven the prices up. Typically, I'd float the idea that you can buy good breeding females that are relatively young, unregistered, commercial stock for $350 to $500 per head. And that's not registered or anything like that. They're not show goats. They're meant to produce for your farm. If you're not looking for breeders right away, if you're just looking for goats to put into a targeted grazing herd for a business, I might recommend wethers or castrated males. The challenge about those is that they are usually sold at about 6 months and 60 pounds for meat, or somewhere in that ballpark. And so very few people raise them beyond that or carry them through a winter. So it may be difficult to find adult or young adult or yearling goats that are castrated males. But if you can find some that are, 9 months old and carry them through the latter part of the winter, those can grow into a really good targeted grazing herd. Obviously, they're not going to produce any new goats for you, but wethers can be really laid back and low maintenance. So they're a good option for a targeted grazing business. How much do goats cost to feed? So when I look at this picture, I see expensive. That's what I see. It's gorgeous too, but this is winter in Iowa where we're located. And once our targeted grazing business wraps up for the season and we start to run out of our small amounts of pasture, we have to start feeding hay and other feeds, purchased feeds to our goats. And so we do have it zeroed in, I think, fairly well, as inexpensive as we can have it and still get good production out of our females, have a good crop of kids in the spring. And we're at about 40 to 50 cents per head per day. Some of you out there may be able to feed cheaper than that. If you've got lots of hay in the region of the US where you're located, and that hay comes pretty inexpensively and it's good quality stuff, man, I wish I could trade places with you. That's not our situation here in central Iowa. Hay is expensive. Goats waste a lot of it. And so we use some hay, but also some other mixed pelleted feeds. And we're at that 40 to 50 cents per head per day mark for adult breeding females that are carrying babies inside them, we hope. When we were a smaller operation, I remember taking note that 10 goats on a round bale, say like a 1,500 pound round bale of good hay, that would last. I'd have to replace that round bale about every month. So about 4 weeks on a good sized round bale for 10 goats. So how old should these goats be before we start using them in our targeted grazing business? And honestly, these guys, they're super young, but they do go out with their mothers on our targeted grazing jobs in the spring. We think it's pretty important that they be exposed to the kind of vegetation that we're going to ask them to graze as adults as we try to make money from our grazing business. They're a huge headache. Getting them on and off of trailers and not losing track of them is a challenge, but it's worth it in the end. Now, we're not going to send this group of little guys out on our very first project in the spring when the weather's still kind of iffy. And here in Iowa, we could have 80 degrees one day and 10 degrees the next and snow blowing. And we're not going to send these guys out to the far corners of the world either. They're going to stay fairly close to home on projects that we feel pretty confident about in good weather. where we can go check on them more often. Those wethers I mentioned, or the yearling females, they have no extra demands on their bodies. They're not taking care of kids. Those are the goats that we're going to send out to some of those projects that have the potential for tougher conditions. And then as these guys get older, we'll stretch their range a little bit further as the weeks go by through the summer. What sex should the goats be? What gender should the goats be for targeted grazing? And I guess I already mentioned that a little bit. We talked about those castrated males. This is a crop of those castrated males, a good looking bunch of wether kids here. If I had 200 of these every year that look just like this, I would absolutely love it. They are weaned from their moms. They've been doing really well. They're putting on weight quickly. That would make almost the best possible herd. So that would make a good group of goats for a targeted grazing operation. But we often wean our goat kids late in the summer. So we have does or nannies, adult females that have had kids, and they're hanging around on our projects. And that is just easy time for us in our goat grazing operation as far as the cycle through the year goes, because those older nannies that have had kids before, they're too big and tired to be jumping fences. They are really laid back. They're not nursing kids anymore, so they don't have quite the same nutritional demands, and life is easy for a while through the rest of that grazing season. So the production cycle doesn't really allow it, but if I could just have one group of goats all the time for our goat grazing business, it would be older nannies that have had kids before, but they've been weaned off. They make a really good grazing crew. So suppose you're not into meat, you're not into milk. Could you do a targeted goat grazing operation with pet goats or show goats, or just, fun around the farm goats? And sure, you could, as long as they haven't been raised, being fed only what you brought them. And there's another caveat there that, yeah, you could do that, but I believe for most folks, it's going to be pretty important to have that other revenue source of an agricultural product to sell as well. The goat grazing business, with the exception of Bill, who's out there tonight, he's one of our affiliates, and he's listening right now, and he's out in California, and he's got almost a year-round operation going. But for many of us here in North America, it's a seasonal business. And so you really need the dual revenue stream of meat or milk as an agricultural product, and goat grazing as a second layer of revenue on top of those goats. But there's no reason why pet or show goats wouldn't get the job done. How many goats do I need for targeted grazing? What you see here is a zoomed in spot in a really large herd of goats, probably, large by Midwest standards, probably 250 to 300 goats in this herd. But for many of our affiliates across the US, we are providing kind of a suburban scale goat grazing operation that doesn't take nearly this many goats. We usually tell folks that in the right market, you can make it work with 20 goats. 30 to 40 to 50 would be nice. It'd be nice to be growing up to that, because with more goats, you can get a project done more quickly and get on to the next project. So if you're in a good market, you've got a waiting list of customers, you'd like to go pretty quickly through your projects, and more goats makes that possible. We have some affiliates in really good markets in the US that can run multiple projects at once. So in that case, you generally want as many goats as it takes to fill your trailer. And you'd want all of those goats to go to one project. Then you'd want to start another project with another trailer load full of goats. So what ends up happening for us and for many of our affiliates is that herd of 30 to 40 goats multiplied several times as their market allows, as the demand in their area allows. But I would say at its most basic, probably about 20 goats to be profitable. What will they eat when doing grazing? Good question. I tell our customers, anything is fair game inside of the enclosure. So that means that some plants you like are probably going to get eaten or at least nibbled on. And there's really not much we can do about that, but we generally take the approach with our customers that, those plants that you really do like aren't going to be there for very long anyway if we don't deal with that other jungle of vegetation that is crowding out all of the preferred vegetation. One example of a plant you prefer is not a reason to not apply goats in an area. That said, we do like to use our portable electric fencing to target the goats on concentrations of the unwanted plant. So if we have a large, let's say we have 10 acres of prairie, for example, and scattered throughout that prairie here and there is wild parsnip or any number of weeds, let's say giant ragweed or whatever, but it's scattered throughout that 10 acres of prairie. And assuming we want to maintain the prairie, we would have to eat 10 acres of prairie in order to get every ragweed in that spot, or every wild parsnip plant in that spot. So that's typically not going to work for us. But if we have one part of the prairie that just didn't get established well, it's that 2 acres at the corner of the prairie next to the woods, and it's got honeysuckle and other brush plants and poison ivy encroaching on it, well, then we can concentrate the goats in that particular place and really help to prevent that prairie from being taken over by the unwanted vegetation. That's just an example. We typically target the goats on those really dense concentrations of the unwanted plants. So what won't they eat when doing targeted grazing? Well, this varies by region across the United States, but goats have the reputation of eating anything and everything, tin cans and all that sort of thing. What's really going on there is that goats are really smart, really curious, and really particular. So they will pick up and try anything or nibble at anything, but they actually have some pretty strong preferences. Fortunately for us, the preferences lean into that invasive and nuisance plant area, and they tend to like most of those. There are some plants, however, that they don't like. And again, that varies by region, but generally we find that if we have a plant that has like a fuzzy, velvety texture, they often don't like those plants. Some sagey plants or mint, we have some wild mint here in the Midwest. They oftentimes don't like those. But it really will depend on your region. We also find that goats can kind of turn on to plants if given enough time and exposure. So there may be a challenging nuisance plant in your area that at first the goats don't seem to like, and you think, uh-oh, my whole grazing business is in trouble here if the goats don't eat this plant. But over time, with enough exposure, the goats really start to, for whatever reason, become adapted to that particular plant, and they'll start to attack it after a while. Some plants, that's the case. That's one more reason why we like to have our kids out there eating with their mothers, because we want to accelerate that process. Our mother goats have been eating the same 6 plants that all of our customers call us to deal with every year for generation upon generation. And so there's no transition time for our goats to start to eat the vegetation that our customers want to have eliminated. All right. Besides the plants, what else do they need? We have found here in the Midwest that most of the vegetation we're called to deal with for our customers is the best possible goat feed we could provide. We can't give them any better food at home than they have on our projects. And if you start to analyze some of the crude protein content of like honeysuckle, poison ivy, multiflora rose, scrub oak, that sort of thing, it's really pretty good. It's better than most hay you could provide. And it's up off the ground, it's high up, and that's what the goats need to avoid having stomach worm problems. So it's really good nutrition out there. If we have any question about the quality of that feed on a project, we will put out a protein tub just to supplement them a little. Other than that, we'll put out a mineral block and water. That's as complicated as it gets for taking care of the goats' nutritional needs on these projects. Again, really, this is the best food we could provide for them in most cases. How do you train goats for targeted grazing? Well, the last time I did this presentation, I said I'd love to train them not to do this, but this is typical goat. Find the one spot where you could get your head stuck in 10 acres of land, and they'll do it. And so that's just life with goats. But beyond that, we really don't train the goats. We give them lots of exposure to the vegetation that they'll be eating all the time. And generation to generation, we have found that our goats get better and better at it and more efficient at it because they're eating the same nuisance plants over and over again for our customers. Training to get on the, so we don't train them what to eat. We let them eat what they want to eat. And over time, they start to turn on to some plants and they really get zeroed in on it. There's other things like getting on and off the trailer. Every year in the spring, it is harder to load the goats onto the trailer than it is at the end of our grazing season when they've been doing it all summer long. And that makes total sense. I believe that we have taken our goats on the trailer so many times with the end result being the gate opens, I get out of the trailer, I've got a whole bunch of really great fresh food that the goats kind of have a positive association with getting on the trailer. So I think that's why, besides just general practice and repetition, I think that's why they get on the trailer a lot better as the grazing season goes on than they do at the beginning. Yeah, it's also important to not so much train, but to condition the goats to that electric fencing that we use before we put them out on a project. And we want to do that in a controlled environment. The first time we introduce them to electric fence, we got to have it all under control and we got to be watching. But once they figure out what that electric fence does, we don't have too much trouble keeping them where they belong. What health issues are a challenge? Lots of health issues are a challenge for goats. You know, you would think that an animal that could eat thistles and thorns and poison ivy would be a really hardy animal. But that's just not the case. Goats are actually a bit fragile. And that's complicated by the fact that we just don't have a lot of experienced vets out there when it comes to goats. This crew here is a class from the Vet Med College at Iowa State University, which is near where we live in Iowa. And so we have taken to invite that class out every year so that they can have hands-on experience with goats, because we just think it's going to be really important that these folks are out there serving people all across the country with a little bit of goat knowledge. The biggest issues that we see: internal parasites, stomach worms, always a challenge for goats. And there's just no way to avoid that. It's just a goat thing. I will say that I think our goats do better than most because they are in a targeted grazing operation. One of the problems with goats is that they're constantly re-ingesting their own stomach worms through their feces that fall on the ground. Then the larvae of those stomach worms crawl up on blades of grass. Then the blades of grass are eaten by the goats. So they reinfect themselves. In our operation, our goats are constantly going to new places that haven't been infected. And they're always eating, typically they're eating up high too. They're not eating with their mouths right down on the ground in a traditional grass pasture sort of environment. So we also cull really hard. So if we have a goat that needs to be treated several times when none of the other goats do, that goat will get marked, and at the end of the season or even earlier, we'll send that goat to market. Other challenges, I mean, I could go on and on. but I'll just say that one of the challenges for us on our farm has been hoof scald or foot scald. Not so much an infection of the main hard tissue of the hoof, but an infection in between the sort of the toes of the goat that is painful for the goats. We've been working hard to eliminate that over time, both by culling and through a vaccination protocol that we've done in cooperation with these folks here at Iowa State University. Other problems can be, we do have some external parasites that can bother goats. Meningeal worm is one that I've mentioned here. Some of you folks who are out there in the Midwest, you may have had experience with this. It's a worm a parasite that is spread by white-tailed deer. Goats pick it up, and since goats are not a natural host for that parasite, the worm lodges itself in the spinal column of the goat. It kind of gets lost in its system, and it causes paralysis or partial paralysis of the rear end of the goat. And that's a really interesting disease that I don't think the vet world knows much about and understands very well. I don't think any of us really understand it very well. And we do come up with at least a couple of cases of that every year. We found a way to work with it, but it still is not fun. Do we trim hooves and give vaccinations? And yes, I would just say that, we have limited veterinary support, local vets that really know goats well. And even if we did, even at $400 a head, a goat is not a very valuable animal. And so we can't pay the vet to come out and do a lot of the doctoring and maintenance chores and still come out ahead money-wise. So we do a lot of our own doctoring. We give our own vaccinations. We do trim hooves. In our system, we trim hooves once a year, whether they need it or not, and they need it after a year. But we don't do it any more often than that. We're not raising show goats. We're raising productive commercial goats on a pasture, and in pasture environments. It is my least favorite chore on the farm, but you get used to it and you get pretty good at it over time. So if you already raise goats out there as you're listening tonight, you understand what I'm talking about. And if you are about to start raising goats, get used to the idea of doing hoof trimming. All right, so I've got one more question. That's what's your next? We've been through some challenging times here, and I think over the last couple of years, and I think it has a lot of people thinking, life's too short to sit in this cubicle or to not pursue a dream of mine. And if your dream is to take some small hobby farm or even a larger farm and build it to a place where you can be doing farm stuff all the time and not have to have that town job or not have to moonlight. Or maybe you're just wanting to get started in a farm operation. Look, I did not grow up on a farm. I did not inherit farmland. When I decided I wanted to be engaged in agriculture, I had to find an unconventional way to get there, and Goats on the Go is my path. And through our affiliate network, it can be your path too. So if that sounds interesting to you, let's talk. All right. We're going to have some pictures fly in of some of our affiliates from all over the country here. They're all types of people, sometimes retirees, sometimes young families. Sometimes they're families who have 4-H goats and they decided that they needed to start paying their own way if those goats were going to stay on the farm. Some folks are seriously pursuing goats as a farm venture. Others are teaching their kids about entrepreneurism and taking risks by becoming a Goats on the Go affiliate and using our help and support and our brand identity to launch their own successful goat grazing businesses all over the US and beyond the US. We do have one affiliate in Canada and one in Tasmania. So we've seen a lot of growth over the last few years. It's a really exciting time, and this is a really cool community of people. So I'd encourage you to reach out if it's something you'd be interested in. All right, I've see we have some questions in the chat box here, so we're going to pull those up. So bear with me 1 second. What is the best hay to feed goats? You know how I mentioned that you'd think anything that could eat poison ivy could just survive on about anything? Well, that's really not true. Goats have really fast metabolisms and they need really high quality feed. We set out originally, when we first got started with goats, we set out to feed them hay and only hay, and quickly learned that that just wasn't possible for us. If you want to feed hay and only hay, you're probably looking at buying close to dairy quality hay. And then watching a lot of it get wasted on the ground, because there's just no good way or waste-free way to feed goats hay. So I would recommend really good Timothy hay or orchard grass alfalfa hay or straight alfalfa hay. The goats, if it gets even the tiniest bit stemmy, at least my experience is our goats just ignore the stems, they eat the leaves, and there's a pile of alfalfa there that costs you a lot of money, and that can be hard to watch. So yeah, and one of our affiliates even commented on that alfalfa is the best. It's got the highest nutritional content, but grassy alfalfa is fine. I think in that sense, a mix with good grass, good high quality grass that's not too stemmy or mature. Yep, some more answers to that question too. Feeding goat nutrition can be kind of complex. So, you know, the easy way to make it not complex is to spend a lot of money on really good hay and waste a lot of it and give them all they want. But the more challenging way, if you want to dial it in, it does take some research and some effort. There are a couple of colleges, University of Maryland, perhaps Cornell University. They have good spreadsheets available to the public that allow you to, they're called ration balancer spreadsheets that allow you to say, well, if I feed high calcium alfalfa over here, how do I balance it with the right amount of phosphorus with a supplement over here or with a mineral block? The spreadsheets will kind of help you figure all that out. Oh boy, we could talk for hours about goat nutrition. Another one of our affiliates is on tonight, Margaret Chalmers. She's in the Kansas City area, and she says hoof trimming is her favorite. Margaret's an odd duck. Yeah, Molly, thanks for the tip. She says vet students are always game to practice hoof trimming. That is a great point. Our local vet college, you saw some of them out there, they have a small ruminant club. And they called me up and said, hey, could we come out to your place and practice trimming some hooves? And I was like, yeah, sure. You know, I'm not going to stand in your way if you want to trim my goat's hooves. So that is a good option if you have maybe not even a vet college nearby, but even like an animal science program at a local university. It doesn't necessarily have to be a vet med college. Cornell Sheep Program. Oh yeah, Cornell Sheep Program had a spreadsheet called Feed Form. May or may not be still available, but you can look up that. Margaret, I'm trying to think of the other university that produces a lot of goat stuff. I believe it's in the Southeast. Langston, there you go. Langston University, I believe, has a ration balancer for goats as well. Folks, while I've got the opportunity, I just want to say thank you again for taking some time out of your evening and tuning in tonight. I really appreciate it. Again, I will stay on as long as there are more questions. So please don't hesitate to type out your questions in that chat tool. But once again, thanks so much for tuning in tonight's presentation. I appreciate it. Thank you, Allison. Appreciate it. And Eric, thanks for tuning in. I'm asked a question here of, do I ever lose goats to predators or to people? On our grazing projects, there's always this trade-off of risks. Like, it feels like you're dropping your kids off at kindergarten for the first time when you leave them overnight on a goat grazing project. But all told, goats just find creative ways to put themselves in danger. So I've come to believe that I am not putting them at any more risk when I put them out on a project than I would at just leaving them in the pasture at home. I'm just exposing them to different risks. And perhaps when you factor in, stomach worms and the quality of the feed that's on some of these projects, maybe they're better off on our projects than they are at the home pasture. Tough call for sure. But we do not lose a lot of goats to predators. Part of that is because of portable electric fencing that we use. Fencing. It's hard for any kind of dog to approach that without getting a good zap. Another benefit we have working in our favor is that we are never in one place for very long. We're going property to property, and even on a property, we're usually shifting the goats a half acre to an acre at a time every few days. So every few days, the scenery changes for a coyote or a fox or some larger predator. So we think that helps a lot too. It takes predators a while to be alerted to the presence of the goats, and then beyond that to actually become bold enough to do anything about it. And about that time, we're either moving on to a different spot or we're changing the scenery on them. Do we lose goats to people? I've never had an affiliate tell me that they've actually had a goat be stolen. I don't think. But we have had cases of mischievousness. Like, for example, there have been a couple of times when our goats got out and there was no explanation for why they got out. And we suspect that we maybe had some teenagers just shutting off our fence energizer or actually opening the fence up and letting the goats out and then putting the fence back together so it wasn't obvious how they might have gotten out. The follow-up question that most people have then is, do you put livestock guardian dogs or a guardian donkey or llama on your projects? And just very generally, we think that all of those guardians just add complication. And especially dogs, like in a public park, people are so litigious anymore. Just, a dog barking loudly at a kid might cause a lawsuit. So we will use guardian dogs on some big remote projects at times, but the vast majority of our smaller projects, we don't use livestock guardian dogs. How old do you keep grazing goats working on the jobs? As long as, again, we are a meat goat operation. Not all of our affiliates are. So we don't have any goats on welfare. When a female goat is not producing kids reliably anymore, we sell her. That typically is, maybe 7, 8 years old at the oldest. So that's what's out on grazing jobs typically reflects what's going on in our home farm. Now we have other affiliates who some of their goats are just mascots, or maybe they're a meat or dairy operation and they're really serious about it with 99% of their herd, but there's 2 or 3 favorite goats that just get to live out their lives in the operation. And I would guess that they probably have 10-year-old goats on some of their projects. Oh, good question. Mitch asks, I'm running goats in tree plantations and eating and stripping bark is becoming an issue with the goats. Any ideas on how to prevent that? Well, I don't mean this to be snarky, but my first thought would be sheep. That sheep might just be a better application, unless, especially the hair sheep breeds, unless those tree plantations are also full of brush, and then I understand why you're running goats there. It's probably not economically viable to, wrap the trunks of every one of those trees in the plantations. Depending on the spacing between the rows of trees, it might be possible to actually run long, skinny paddocks with the electric netting and not even give the goats access to those trees. Yeah, beyond that, that is a real challenge. I don't have any experience with like spraying trees with a repellent or anything like that that makes them taste nasty. There is some research on goats in vineyards where they actually treated the grape vines and the grape leaves with sodium chloride. No, sodium chloride would just be salt, wouldn't it? They treated them with some chemical that was generally safe, but made them a little bit nauseous when they ate it. And they actually had pretty good success with that. But the goats would have to have that experience, and then every once in a while have to be exposed to it again. They'd have to treat the leaves again, because the goats would start to figure out, oh, these leaves actually taste pretty good, you know, the ones that aren't treated. So you might do a Google search for that study. Yeah, I think we answered the question about livestock guardian dogs. Okay. I'm still here, going strong, if anybody has more questions. Oh yeah, that's a good point, Eric. And that is something I have heard before too, from folks who have tried donkeys and llamas. In fact, Eric points this out about donkeys, but I think it's true of llamas and alpacas too, that if you're using them for protection, you can really only use one, because if you put two or more together, they'll kind of form their own herd and not pay much attention to the sheep or goats. They don't really bond with the animals so much as they just mix with the animals to be part of a herd. So if you have a couple of donkeys or a couple of llamas, they're going to go off on their own. I don't have any personal experience with that, but I have also heard that, which is kind of disappointing, because a mini donkey, if really effective against predators, is really convenient for our operation, because you can often just put the donkey out with the goats and not have to feed them anything different. So there's no other care concerns like there would be for a livestock guardian dog. A good question here. I'm asked about pricing for a goat grazing business. That's something that I talk about in quite a bit of detail, some actual example numbers, with anybody who's interested enough in our affiliate program to give me a phone call. So that might be something you want to pursue, but I don't want to just dodge your question entirely. The question is it best for a flat rate, to charge a flat rate, or a price per goat per head per day, or $1 per acre? And I'll just say that all of our affiliates can charge however they like. They are independently owned businesses, so they make their own decisions about pricing. But the recommendation we give them in our training is to charge by the acre or by the area, rather than price per head per day or some other variation, or charging, this much for the goats, this much for me to be there, this much for every time I have to return to the site, this much for every time I have to move the fence. We just like to make it as simple as possible for the customer, and to put the responsibility of projecting it, the amount of time it takes for a certain number of goats, on ourselves. We just feel like that's an important part of the service we provide to our customers, and it's less confusing to them. Margaret says that that her solo mini donkey is fantastic, and she actually eats the thistles and eats the branches off of honeysuckle. Awesome. Maybe just a whole herd of donkeys then, Margaret. Yeah, that was a good question about the hay. I, it's it's just a challenge. We just find hay to be a real challenge in terms of the waste and not knowing what the quality of the hay is. My suggestion would be that if you're going to feed hay, that you have some tests done on the hay, like buy all your hay from one supplier, have it tested. That way, you know if you have to supplement anything on in addition to the hay to give them the nutrition they need. Goats are small animals. They can only eat so much. So if they stuff themselves full of hay and still haven't extracted the nutrition they need, then you're in trouble. You need to provide a richer feed as a supplement. Do your goats need to have some experience before they go out? Like, should you buy some really experienced ones rather than just put all newbies on a job? And I think generally, if the goats you're using, whether they've been out on a targeted grazing project or not, if they've been free to browse in a pasture, unless that pasture is straight up pure bluegrass or pure Timothy, they're probably at least used to searching out things and trying different things. And that's the experience you really need. That said, goats are a follow the leader sort of animal. So having some old hands out there that really know their stuff, the goats will mimic them. The other goats will mimic them, follow them, attempt to compete with them, and catch on faster. Sorry, that was kind of a bit of a compromise answer. That would actually be a good reason to keep a goat or two that isn't producing kids for you anymore, even if you're trying to be profitable as a meat or dairy operation. A few of them, really old hands that are really experienced at targeted grazing, keeping those around to mix in with a group of younger goats each year. That's a reason why I could be convinced to keep goats that are otherwise unproductive, as long as they're healthy. Okay, everybody, I'm going to wrap it up there. Thanks again so much for tuning in tonight. Have a great evening and a happy new year. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Aaron.
You're welcome. Good night.
Thank you.